let's kick off the keynote session. And I would like to invite Dominik Schwickert, the Executive Director of das progressive Zentrum, for his welcoming words. Dominik, the floor is yours.
Yeah, dear progressives, distinguished guests, it's my greatest pleasure to welcome all of you to this year's Progressive Governance Summit, the PGS 22. And a special warm welcome to our friends who traveled from far away in order to be with us today. Willkommen in Berlin, welcome to Berlin. So exactly 10 years ago, I visited my first PGS, the PGS 12, that took place in Dublin and was by then hosted by the British think tank Policy Network that initiated actually this conference series 3 decades ago. I remember well that in 2012 I was quite proud to be part of the German delegation that was invited to, Maria said, Europe's largest conference for progressive politics, which is at the same time a big family meeting for the broader progressive movement and which has such a rich intellectual legacy. And now it is already the 5th edition that we as DPZ host this summit series in Berlin, which for me is just mind-blowing and of course a huge privilege. So it's again PGS time, and I promise you we have an exciting PGS day here at the Haus Ungarn ahead of us, packed with about 20 excellent sessions on our core theme of joining forces. We have political leaders as well as up-and-coming politicians with green, liberal, left and social democratic backgrounds, but who all share the passion to drive change and the urge to actually turn ideas into action. And over the course of the day, we expect around 800 guests on this summit, and we will all meet great political thinkers and doers from a dozen European countries, the US and Canada. And bringing together this great progressive community from all over the place deeply resonates not only with the core mission of our organization, or my organization, the DPZ, it was and is only possible with the support of our outstanding international partner organization who helped us to put today's program together. So thank you so much for joining forces, building alliances of progressive brother and sister think tanks and organizations, and please a big applause for that. So why joining forces? This is a particularly testing week for Europe, the US, Canada, and all our allies across the globe. We are in what appears to be the midst of a perfect storm, as Wolfgang Schmidt puts it in his European countries are seeking to stand together and striking to find a compromise to financially support their people during the unfolding economic hardships of the consequences of this war. The energy crisis, inflation, a cost of living crisis, social unrest. Hardly ever before have the stakes on political decision makers, especially those in government, been higher than at the beginning of this winter. Because of the promise of progress that has kept our post-war liberal democracies together over these last decades is shaken to its core by the current crisis. And what we need is a renewal of the promise of progress, a promise of progress that is not only convincing in theory, but translates improvement of people's everyday lives. So what does progress mean in the 2020s? Does it mean the absence of war? Does progress mean the resilience, the preparation for future risks? Or Does it mean the realization that less is more, that reducing certain freedoms of our current way of life that goes at the cost of the planet and future generation is the path to more collective freedom? Honestly, I do not know the answer. I guess nobody does, and probably there's no single answer. But what I do know is that the return to the status quo ante is not an option, because it's the former status quo that has put us in this very difficult situation we are in now. And what I also do know is that it's time for fundamental change. Change in our relation to nature and our environment, change in questions of social justice, change in our global economy, and also change in the way democracies join forces and build alliances. Let me be clear, I don't want to be cynical, but we all know such moments of profound crisis can also be moments of profound progress. But we have to identify the policies and the political mechanisms of how to make this work at home and internationally. So for the progressives, now seems to be the right moment to come together to reflect what progressive politics must prioritize in times of crisis. What can give us hope and sometimes inspiration is that there are progressive governments in power, including at least the US, Canada, Germany, Spain, Portugal, France, Finland, Norway, Australia, New Zealand, and so on and so forth. I'm convinced those center-left governments in power can boost new ideas of progress globally, or at least they can contribute, if they join forces and build alliances. At PGS 22, we ourselves want to make a little contribution to share and multiply progressive ideas on how to tackle the crisis, how to build up capacities for progressives to govern, and how to improve the lives of the people. And I'm very excited about today's kickoff. We will start with a scene-setting keynote featuring Anke Hassel and Werz and their summit paper on progressive politics and authoritarianism abroad and at home, which is inside here. This input will set the ground for today's overall agenda on why and how we have to join forces, especially in those crazy times of multiple profound crises. I wish you all an inspiring summit day, and thank you so much for being with us. And the floor is yours, Michael and Anke.
Yes, thank you, Dominic, for these very kind words, and thank you also for inviting us here and giving us the opportunity to speak. I've been coming to the PGS summits for about 20 years, and I think these are the most exciting conferences that are actually around. Definitely much more exciting than in any academic conference, but also much more exciting than most political conferences. So I'm very pleased to be here, and I look forward to this day of discussions. Joining forces, building alliances, and drive change is the theme of this year's PGS. And this theme is in tradition of other PGSs before, because the aim is always to bring heads of states, people in government together with activists and with people who are joining the movement, and also to combine local issues with global issues. So that is really in the tradition of the PGS, and I think it is a great way to do that. But when we talk about new alliances to shape the world of tomorrow, I think we have to start with the world of today, and Dominic has already alluded to that. And to engage with the world of today, it means also that we have to understand what has changed. And what has changed over the last 3 years, if not 10 years, is that we are in a new geopolitical constellation. And the best example for that, an indicator for that, is the Russian invasion in Ukraine. The Russian invasion in Ukraine symbolizes not only the disregard of international norms, something that we have got used to, but also the end of an era of post-socialism, which started with the fall of the Berlin Wall and had great hopes for democratization across the globe. And in the 1990s delivered this hope for democratization, but this has also come to an end. And it also symbolizes the vulnerability of Europe to authoritarian regimes in a way which we had never envisaged before. So today, when heads of states talk about new packages, how to protect families and industries from rising prices and from the energy crisis, they always deal with three issues, and these three issues are interrelated. The first issue is economic insecurity and social inequality. The second issue is climate change and a just transition. And the third issue, and that comes more and more to the forefront, is authoritarianism and the rule of law. And these three issues, the three challenges, have a firm grip on both the domestic agenda and international politics. And they're interdependent to a degree that we cannot imagine solving one of them without addressing the other. We have to think of all three challenges together, and we have to think in terms of domestic solutions and global politics. Currently, these three challenges are forming a vicious circle. And just think a little bit, or to start thinking about it, about economic insecurity. Just in the last 15 years, we've lived through three crises. And these crises started with a great financial crisis in 2008. Then we had the pandemic over the last 3 years. And now we have a new crisis with the energy crisis and inflation. Each of these crises has meant an increase in economic insecurity for families and industries. At each time, jobs were threatened, livelihoods were at stake. Families lost savings and they lost earnings. And each crisis encouraged the populist far right to take advantage of this situation and to promote an authoritarian agenda. In each crisis, democratic institutions lost a little bit of trustworthiness because governments could not protect people. They could not protect these livelihoods fully. In each crisis, governments doubled down on their growth strategies. In each crisis, they pursued more a growth strategy that is based on fossil fuels, which we have to change. So economic insecurity and social inequality contribute to the resistance of people against a just transition, and it enables the authoritarian right to campaign on economic worries. And we can similarly argue that when we talk about climate change. Climate change policies upset familiar behavior. We have families that depend on long commutes, they depend on cars, they depend on their consumption of fossil fuels. And we need a change in behavior of everybody in order to tackle climate change. And that again gives the authoritarian right an opportunity to campaign against that because they can use these worries, what will happen if I cannot use my car anymore, what will happen if prices rise, against progressive governments. And they can also fill the role of protecting traditional lifestyles, which they often do. So what can progressives do? We have to turn the negative, vicious circle which consists of insecurity, resistance against change, and creeping authoritarianism into a virtuous circle. A virtuous circle that connects economic security, social equality with visions of a better future, and a strong commitment to democratic values. And for that, we need to build bridges. For that, we need to build alliances. And the bridge and the alliance we need to build is between young activists who care the most about climate change, who campaign the most vigorously on social issues, with those who are in power, who are in government, who can actually design policies. And this alliance means that both sides have to be more patient and have to be more tolerant against each other and has to stop fighting each other as they so often do. We need to build an alliance of social justice and climate-friendly policies, and that includes a much fairer distribution of the costs of climate change and climate adaptation. And we need to build an alliance against authoritarianism. Too often we leave authoritarianism unchallenged because the boundaries are unclear. No country is free of the populist right at the moment. Italy will be the first big EU member state, which will end up with a far-right government. In other countries of the EU, we already had far-right parties in government, and Sweden is the latest example for that. Hungary, I don't need to talk about Hungary. We all know Hungary has become not only an authoritarian state, but as Katharina Barley said last night, we can almost call it a dictatorship. So the worry that progressive governments have about authoritarianism restricts the policy space they can use, because they cannot implement climate change policies in the way they want to do, because there's a reaction by the far right. For instance, they have to subsidize fossil fuels, even if they don't want to. But they also find it more difficult to embrace social issues, for instance, on migration. So we need to deal with authoritarianism domestically and globally, and I hand over to Michael to continue that for the global stage.
Thank you very much, Anke, and let me just mention what a pleasure it was to work with you on this paper, because we both come from different ends of the spectrum, so to speak. You are an expert on domestic, social, climate, and European affairs, and I dabble in the world of international security. And probably 2 or 3 years ago, we would not have sat together and tried to come up with a joint paper. But as you say, it is important to build bridges. Vertical bridges between generations, as you rightly point out, but also horizontal bridges across regions. And my feeling is that we confront a tectonic shift in domestic, but also in geopolitics. And I also feel very strongly that we have to recognize that fighting against authoritarianism domestically also, possibly for the first time, historically speaking, requires a strong position on international affairs, including military security. Now, that's a discussion that we are not necessarily comfortable with, coming from a progressive spectrum of the debate. But I believe that if you look back at the end of the Cold War, where in the early 1990s, we were under the impression that democracy had won, that history had ended, and enlightened democracies were the future, and that there was a unipolar moment where there was one remaining superpower, namely the United States. Looking back, I think we have to admit we couldn't have been more wrong. Francis Fukuyama was right. It was the end of history, but not in the sense that there was a bourgeois, liberal, enlightened world that would be globalized. It was, to a degree, the end of the West as we know it from Cold War times. And I think one of our misperceptions was that we thought, we as Western Europeans or North Americans, since, quote unquote, we won the Cold War, it meant that the Easterners had to change, but the West had not to change. It was a second big misperception. Because I think what we didn't realize in hindsight is that with the end of the Cold War, the clear-cut separation between the domestic and the international also got diluted. And that's why I strongly believe the war that is being fought in Ukraine and the question of how it ends has an immediate effect on whether we will be able and successful in pushing back against illiberal forces in our respective society. There is a nexus between the international and the domestic. I think this is an important point to recognize, because old certainties are really gone. We have to embrace a new world that we're not always comfortable with. And we have to try to maintain an emancipatory perspective and democratic principles, as you point out. But at the same time, it is also sometimes, and today it is, important to talk about exporting arms so one side on a violent battlefield can be supported. To bring these two together will not always be possible. It's more often impossible than it is possible, but that doesn't mean we have the moral or political right or the luxury to shy away from this discussion. So I think Ukraine showed several things. It showed that this conflict, even though a lot of people are dying, is still a regionally contained conflict, but it has gone global within the first 96 hours after the invasion. Food prices, energy scarcity, every corner of the world is being affected by this war, which is happening in a territory that's, in general terms, relatively small. It's a few thousand square kilometers. So that's something qualitatively new. If you think back, even the Iraq war, which was a much bigger war, had less of an immediate impact on all our lives and the lives of people in the world than this one has. And the second dimension that I find interesting is we, again in the West, in Europe and the United States, we thought this is a colonial imperial aggression against Ukraine. Everybody will agree with us. Now, the United Nations vote showed that many of the countries that we thought were our close friends and allies actually did not agree with us. I understand why that is. I also think this is an additional reason to take up one of the points that was made yesterday, to more strategically think about coalitions in the global south and to be more honest when it comes to European and US policies in Africa, Latin America, and South Asia. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not ironic that countries that cherish their anti-colonial tradition like South Africa and India can't make up their minds in the United Nations whether that invasion is actually wrong. I find that hard to understand. But this is also showing a situation where in the Western world we have a very peculiar perspective on this conflict that is not really shared by everybody. So I think that is also kind of a dimension that we probably have to work through. But this has to lead into a conversation about how North-South relations play out and how we actually create more common purpose along the democratic principles that you rightly uphold. And my last point here is that I think the qualitative difference that we see with this war, where Vladimir Putin is weaponizing hunger and takes millions of Africans hostage, in a context where now the World Food Program estimates that over 820 million people are suffering hunger. And we have to recognize that if only 10% of these people don't make it, we'll have more victims than during the entire Second World War. This is a catastrophe of global dimensions. And this also means that we have to win the narratives, especially in Africa, where many countries are still convinced and are being convinced by the Russians that do a lot of outreach, that this is actually NATO, the United States, the European Union, you name it, all the bad guys from their perspective. So new alliances mean thinking horizontally and vertically at the same time, thinking in intergenerational terms, but I also believe in strong regional terms. And from my perspective, not only because I've been spending the last 20 years of my life in the United States, this needs to be a rapidly, vigorously, and systematically re-enhanced and modernized transatlantic relation. Not only because I think you here in Europe need to be completely clear about the fact that without the massive and rapid military response by the United States, and I'm not a warmonger, but I think this needs to be absolutely clear, that the United States reacted within hours after the initiation of the war, and the United States was better prepared than the Europeans because there were so many in Europe that were still in denial that this war would happen. Had the United States not reacted so quickly, and had we not spent billions and billions of dollars to continue supporting the Ukrainians, there is a realistic chance that you would have Russian soldiers at the Polish border today, that Norway and Sweden would not negotiate NATO membership, but an appeasement accord with the Russians. And here in Berlin, we would live in a very, very different world, and the EU and NATO would look very, very differently. This was really a split-second historical moment in which it was absolutely clear that without those strong transatlantic ties, all our lives might have looked very, very different than they do now. And so I think this should be a point of departure. And Ricarda Lang yesterday made that exact point. She said, I grew up in a generation where transatlantic stuff didn't really matter. It was there, but it didn't really matter. And she came to the conclusion that it matters, not because she spoke to me or she came to Washington and said, oh, this is really interesting, we need to do this. It was her concrete political and social experiences in Germany that got her to that conclusion. So I think this is a very solid and a very important base for our conversation. We need to move into this direction, and that includes, like it or not, a conversation amongst all of us of where we stand on military security, of how far we are willing to go in defending democratic principles because they are under siege, and how we figure out the nexus between the fact that authoritarianism in Russia has directly led to the invasion in Ukraine, that we in all our Western societies are struggling with authoritarian movements that are sometimes supported and enhanced and forced by Russia and China, and how to deal with these issues. When I arrived in Berlin Saturday morning, jet-lagged from Washington, I ran into the AfD demonstration right here on Friedrichstraße, close to 10,000 people. And one of the neo-Nazi demonstrators spray-painted "fuck Joe Biden" on one of the trash cans. That's not only a tremendous insult to a good man and to the presidency of the United States, but it also shows that these right-wing extremists, they have somewhat of a notion of an international movement, and we need to counter that. Thank you so much.
Okay. Anke Hassel, bitte bleiben Sie. Thank you so much, Anke Hassel, Michael Werz. You have set the scene for our day today, but before we all disperse and go to the respective sessions of your interest, I would still like to ask you one question. One last question, so don't go. So the history, it's not the end of history. History is going on, and we are definitely facing a polycrisis, overcoming the pandemic, facing Russian aggression on Ukraine, which is on hostility to the West, authoritarian tendencies, inflation, skyrocketing energy prices. This is all gloomy. But what gives you hope, Anke Hassel?
Well, the hope, actually, events like this and seeing so many young people who get really involved in the movement and who are active on climate change, who are active on democracy, that gives me hope. I think it's the new generation. Okay, Michael?
Every crisis creates opportunities. This big crisis creates tremendous opportunities. I think it was a bloodline for an ailing European Union. It has dramatically reinvigorated transatlantic relations. It has given us in the United States a better understanding that the United States needs partners in the world and engage in multilateral affairs, which we usually don't do. And a lot of people in the world have been making up their minds that this means the necessity for them to act differently. Had you told me 2 years ago that the Europeans would absorb 5 million refugees, even though they were in the majority women and children and they were mostly white, I would still have told you this is not going to happen. So it showed the elasticity and the willingness of European societies to step up. Hopefully we'll be able to preserve this energy, but I think by and large, the reaction to this war in Ukraine has been nothing short of astonishing.
Okay. So we're joining forces. That's the answer, I guess. Well, great. The next session is starting right now. Thank you very much for our wonderful keynote speakers. And another round of applause, of course. I will now tell you where to go to join which session. On the main stage.